It will when I hit the button. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Ordinary Takes. I'm Andrew Smith. I'm here in Tennessee, and I've got my good friend Peter Werbe joining us from Detroit, Motor City.
Hey, how you doing?
Home of the Cass Corridor neighborhood near Wayne State University that features prominently in your new novel. So this is Ordinary Takes. If you're just new to the show, we are a Facebook live stream and then later a podcast archived, a joint production of teacherontheradio.com and ordinarytakes.org. So a Michigan man had spent some time in East Lansing at Wayne State and moved back to the Motor City, the heart of Detroit, when he was really a mid-20s young adult, maybe a little bit too old for the hippie revolution. But he was finding out that the hippies were not just tie-dyes and psychedelic batik prints and vegetarian food like you're eating in the story, but it was also a militant countercultural uprising of multi-faceted ideologies and hopes and dreams for the future of the world during the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement. And I'm here to talk to you about your new book. It's called The Summer on Fire, a Detroit novel.
Are you describing me or the characters in the book or what?
Well, anyway, so I'm all excited about the novel, obviously, but Peter Werbe is a activist, a journalist, and editor of the Fifth Estate magazine for about 55 years, longest continuous running underground publication in North America. It was originally affiliated with such great publications as the San Francisco Oracle, the East Village Other, and the Berkeley Barb, which were called the Underground Press. These were fanzines before they had fanzines, blogs before they had blogs, true independent media.
Well, one thing that's very important about the Underground Press, excuse me, was that at one point, 1970, the combined circulation of the so-called Underground Press had a weekly circulation of 4 million. And that meant very frequently the same articles about the Black Panther Party, about the anti-war movement, about Black liberation and gay liberation and women's liberation were all coming out to communities of activists that were mobilizing around those ideas. So it was very powerful at the time. Not impressed?
Wouldn't you say that it was social media before there was social media? It was a community. Like one of the scenes that gets described in the book and that I experienced 20 years later for between the 20th and 30th anniversary was the feeling you got when you walked into the office and there were these old typesetters and there were these, radical posters covering the wall, that the underground press, the underground newspaper office itself was a locus of great activity, wouldn't you say?
It was, but this is not that unusual. If you go back, now 120 years or so, with the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, the Wobblies. Do you have your IWW shirt on today? No.
Actually, I should have. I'm wearing a Grateful Dead t-shirt. They're in your book too. I actually have.
Wait, let me finish. It was the same thing. They had this nationwide press. For instance, they had a newspaper in the Finnish language that had 30,000 a week in northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So that too was part of this enormous movement at the time. So each movement up till the digital age, there you go. There's your IWW hat. I should go get mine. Up until the digital age, anytime there was a movement worth, I shouldn't say worth, but that of any magnitude, it always produced its own press, because you know what we thought about the mainstream corporate media? That it was fake news.
I feel so sad because outside of the context of what's actually going on, it doesn't make sense. But inside the context, it's also been misappropriated. But this language of stopping the corporate media, I was listening to this disgusting rhetoric from the CPAC gathering, down in Florida, where they're not wearing any masks, and they've got the golden statue of the former president, that shall not be named. And they're using this kind of anti-corporate media rhetoric to their core. But we definitely believe that the press would have the Hearst family, right? So these radical publications in the 20s that you're referring to were these like grassroots daily publications of the labor movement, the anarchist movement, the socialist movement, the communist movement. There was such a broad-based left in the United States in the 20s. And so when the 60s happened, did people say, oh, you guys are just like the 20s?
There was no historical reference whatsoever. In fact, we began meeting people that were active during the 1930s, and some of them were in their late 40s or mid 50s. And we thought, God, who are these old people? Are they still around? Because if you think, say, between 1939 and 1965, that's 26 years. So someone could have been an activist at 20 in 1939, and I know my math may be getting confused, but only in their mid 40s by 1965. And no, there was very, very little connection with past movements. And the same thing with the Fifth Estate. When we ran into these anarchists who were in there at the time in their 70s and 80s, who were all born around 1900, we were flabbergasted that there were anarchists in the United States. We thought they were all an historical, political footnote. But there needs to be a continuity, and I think mainly it could because of the digital world, that there is more of a continuity. So
I felt it when I met you. So I came up in Ronald Reagan and punk rock, and I first went to the Uncooperative. I don't think I met you that day, but I went to the Uncooperative in '85, and you had all your posters, on the wall. Some of them were very provocative. One of them said Hinckley had a vision. I mean, that's an extremely provocative poster.
I didn't do it.
It
Well, I hope your voice is sounding better to the audience than it is to me. It seems to have just turned into single musical notes, which is fairly interesting. And I can continue.
We had a brief internet blip, and in the recording, and that will probably be represented by something, but it seems to have come back. The internet seems to have come back. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, so in the '80s, we were looking at the Dead Kennedys and MDC, and so the punk rock thing was happening. So I came from a high school in the suburbs, and I'd never been to the Cass Corridor before, and it was like my eyes fell out of my head. I was so blown away by the energy of the Detroit kind of underground scene, and I didn't even know it was your offices then. And then a couple of years later, I came back, but I'm coming up under Ronald Reagan, president. The threat of nuclear war. We're watching these movies like The Day After. We're sure that we're all going to die, in a nuclear holocaust. We've got troops threatening Central America, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, military invention. The Contra thing was going on in Nicaragua. The Sandinista revolution seemed hopeful at the time. And so here we are. And I met you, and I definitely had the idea of the continuity then as an 18 and 19-year-old in the late 80s. And I met you, and you were in your late 40s. I definitely got it. Oh, this guy's from back in the day. My parents had marched in the 60s and 70s. And so I definitely had this idea that I came out of this lineage. And it's probably because of the kind of creative propaganda that you're talking about in Summer on Fire. I was calling it Summer of Fire, like Summer of Love, but it's Summer on Fire. So let's get the audience caught up to speed. They can go to fifthestate.org or to peterwerbe.org for more information. And this is an episode of Ordinary Takes. I'm your host, Andrew Smith, and my guest is author and activist Peter Werbe. So Peter Werbe is discussing his brand new novel. So first of all, you've been a journalist. Most of your life you write nonfiction. Sometimes you write, somewhat editorial style. You write pedantic, sort of persuasive writing. Sometimes you write actual reporting where you're just telling the story of what happened. And you worked in the public sector as a radio DJ, where you were a talk show host, an opinion host on the liberal side, which is so rare. That another guy that shouldn't be named, who died last week, when his fame was rising, you had some notoriety because people would ask, where is the liberal talk show host? And people would say, well, there's this one guy. And, there was
another little glitch here. Again, I don't know whether people can hear me. Andrew has turned in to just
but
individual
but
notes, but it could be because of his love of music. Hopefully, it will return soon. I see he's
I can
smiling.
hear you just fine. So Peter, let's get back to the premise of why you would want to write a novel after years of writing journalistic nonfiction. What brought you to the page for fiction?
I should have, like there's sometimes guests will ask hosts not to ask them certain questions. I should have asked you not to ask that one because I began it probably in late summer 2019. And I don't remember the genesis of it. It was something, well, let me see if I can shorten this story. I was on Monhegan Island and looking through these old newsletters. And my sister, my dear sister Susan, had an article in this 1968 Monhegan Voice mimeographed little publication. And at the end of an article about the anti-draft movement, she said, the time for talk is over. The time is action is now. And I thought, yeah, that's pretty cool. Maybe I can make a story out of that. So I just started writing, and most writers have an outline. They designate who the characters are. They know how it's going to end. This totally went organic, or began organically, and went that through the whole time. I mean, I don't think I had more than a few scribbles of notes. It just sort of flowed out of me. It took actual events and expanded them and fictionalized them, but all to make the points about the resistance to the war, what happened when you oppress a whole people for hundreds of years, what happens when you create a community of resistance, like you were talking about, what ideas can be formulated in order to make you understand why people submit to authority when it's not in their self-interest or in their or in the interests of their community, and on. So I think it's a good story. You seem to like it.
Well, you seem to have a lot of moral and historical reasons to write this book, but for the reader, it's a page turner. It is a hot page turner about this crazy young married couple, eating good food, partying all night long, going to clubs, having a little bit of sex. Now, the dirty parts are pretty PG. This isn't, an R-rated novel by any means. But this was very much a time period of cultural foment. And the two main characters are this young married couple, Paul and Michelle. Is that right? Is that the characters' names?
Paul and Michelle. And someone said if I didn't want people to think it was an autobiography, which it isn't, they said I shouldn't have called the characters Paul and Michelle because Peter and Marilyn is a little too close. They're suggestive of me, but if you went to each episode and said, did that really happen? Which people are beginning to ask. I'd say, well, a little, but it didn't happen in the summer of 1967 where the book is situated in those 7 weeks during a hot summer with anti-war demonstrations and massive black rebellions. Or it might have happened to somebody else, but I assigned it to Paul and Michelle, or Michelle did things I did, and I did things that Michelle is attributed. So you can't get a personal history out of it. But if people think it's me and my wife, cool.
Well, I'm teaching nonfiction right now in a creative writing class here at Tennessee Tech, where I work in Tennessee, and we have some teachers of nonfiction, and nonfiction has a fairly high code of the truth. And they mean factuality, which, interestingly enough, Peter, you would like. When I teach the Bible, I teach it kind of more as mythology, simply because we can't verify it as a factual story. But today, were you to write an autobiography, and you had a good professional editor, your editor would want you to be able to fact check it as being honest. And popular memoirs that are bestsellers that go on Oprah, there's been great scandals for the people who lie, right? So you definitely wrote a novel based on history, and there's no question that the genre is fiction. It's hot, you guys. It starts out and you said it's 93 degrees and he's riding his bicycle down Woodward Avenue. I mean, I was in it from the first sentence, and when it was over, I was sad it ended, and it flew by way too quickly. It flew by so fast. So we've already got a question. That's a pretty deep question from one of our viewers. A guy by the name of William Boyer. I think you might have heard of him, a fellow author and activist and musician.
Yes. Bill actually read part of it. So,
Bill, I can't wait to hear your response after.
He's probably wondering where his signed copy is. Is that his
Well,
question?
he's got a pretty deep question. I think Bill, I hope you can stay with us for the hour. I'm Andrew Smith. This is the Ordinary Takes podcast. We'll be with Peter Werbe at least till 1 p.m. Eastern and noon Central. We might go over a minute, but we've got a good 40 minutes left in the program. Thank you for joining us on Facebook Live. This will be later archived on Spotify and all your Apple Podcasts and all your podcast platforms. Peter, why don't we get into this? I requested this particular excerpt. Did you go with the one I asked for, or did you go with a different one?
It's kind of mixed.
So I'm really interested in this music club called the Grandee Ballroom, and one of the kind of side highlights of this novel is the music of the period. And so there was a venue called the Grandee Ballroom where you could go see the Jefferson Airplane. You could see Cream, the Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix, all the touring psychedelic bands, the Stooges and MC5, of course, which came out of Detroit. And so I asked Peter to read at least a little bit of something connected with the Grandee Ballroom. So Peter Werbe, author of this debut novel, just hot off the press, now available, peterwerbe.org, an independent novel. It's going to sell out of its first run probably within days. So if you want to get on the first printing, you better order it soon. The second printing, I'm sure, will come within a couple of months. I expect this book to far exceed Peter's expectations because of how excellent it is. So let's just get into story time here. Let's be children with wide eyes, and Uncle Pete's going to tell us a story from back in the 60s, straight out of his debut novel, Summer on Fire. Peter Werbe.
Well, let me set it up first. Just back a little. If you go to my website, peterwerbe.com or .org, there are footnotes. You say footnotes to a novel. Well, you don't need the footnotes for the story, but it expands the actual historical stuff that's in there. So that's the value of that. All right, you want me to read this? All right. So it is late. It is probably, it'd be June. I'm trying to situate it. It's late June 1967, and Paul and Michelle Ross, who are the chief protagonists of Summer on Fire, and their two friends, Jeff and Linda, are going to go to the Grandee Ballroom, and they're going to hear the MC5 and Janis Joplin perform, and Cream, by the way. So, and they both have motorcycles. So the two couples donned their gear, jumped on their Super Hawks, those are motorcycles, and headed down West Grand Boulevard towards where the Grandee was located. The night air was warm, so the riders planned to ditch their heavy clothing once they arrived at the ballroom. As they passed buildings at 45 miles an hour, that's 20 miles over the speed limit. Oh, I forgot one little bit. They all smoked very powerful marijuana, and Paul, the only one, dropped a hit of acid, LSD, and the LSD was beginning to take effect. Anyways, they're going 45 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, and Paul is driving one of the motorcycles with Michelle on the back. Paul thought he didn't remember the road having so many curves, but he easily followed its arc when it went one way and then the other. Michelle pounded him on the back. Paul, what the hell are you doing? Stop swerving all over the place. Swerving, Paul thought. I'm just following the road. However, the road seemed very strange, almost fantasy-like, with familiar cars like a Chevy Malibu or a Nash Rambler coming almost alive, resembling cartoon characters. Holy crap, he thought. Can I say the F word on this? Where's my host?
It's a podcast, Peter. You can say whatever you want.
Okay, thank you. Holy crap, he thought. I'm really getting fucking high from this shit I took. He'd been high enough times to invoke the willpower to hold it together until they arrived at the Grandee a mile ahead. But time stretched out so it was as if they had been on the bikes for hours. The road continued to snake back and forth, even up and down, creating hills that were never there before, with the cartoon characters parked in front of stores where eerie commodities into the display windows beckoned to him demonically. Just go straight, follow Jeff. Just go straight, follow Jeff, his mind kept repeating. Finally, they arrived at the Grandee entrance, the place where he could find refuge and his brain could find calm. Instead, there was a crowd in front of the box office screaming slogans and carrying picket signs. Wasn't this where we were going to spend the night away from? He thought. They parked their bikes and walked up to the demonstration. Paul was incapable of talking, but Jeff inquired, "What's up, dude?" He asked the long-haired, bearded guy wearing a multicolored paisley shirt and matching headband. Paul, looking through his purple haze, saw the teardrop designs moving, with some of them weeping tears that flowed into the ones below. Paisley Man told him in strident tones, "That capitalist pig, Uncle Russ, the owner, has raised the admission price to $5. The community is letting him know we are pissed and won't stand for it. The usual price is $2.50, and that's a lot of money for most of us, but raising it by almost 100% to $5 is total capitalist bullshit." Signs read, "Uncle Russ is a capitalist pig and Russ is a ripoff," and these were chanted by about 15 unhappy patrons as slogans echoed down the streets. The signs referred to a Dearborn school teacher and local DJ, Russ Gibb, who was inspired to bring a psychedelic ballroom venue to Detroit after visiting San Francisco's Fillmore Auditorium that featured rock and roll performers who were defining the new counterculture scene. The ballroom was built in 1928, and Gibb originally booked local acts such as the MC5, the Woolies. Woolies used to back, when they came to town, would back Chuck Berry and the Rationals, but quickly hooked into the touring scene of major label rockers such as The Who, The Grateful Dead, and the Chambers Brothers. The Grandee was still a hall for dancing and romancing, stretching across 3 generations of Detroiters, but also for community events such as the Fifth Estate's first anniversary freakout, as it was called, in December 1966, featuring the MC5 and Cosmic Expanding. Paisley Man, whose head now took on that design in Paul's cosmically expanding brain, told him, "But we're going in. We don't want to miss the show." Paul and Michelle and Jeff and Linda walked up the one flight of wooden stairs. Walked up one flight to the wooden ballroom floor where their parents danced to the music of the Buddy Morrow Band. The clanking of their boots on the steel treads as they walked up seemed to Paul like the longest flight of stairs he'd ever climbed, and sounded to him like hammers hitting an anvil. As they entered the dance floor, the MC5 was already rocking out one of their signature tunes, "Kick Out the Jams." Paul looked at the other 3 who were melting a bit. "I'm so fucking high," he said. This was okay, though. He was inside this sanctuary of music and dope, surrounded by people like him. No threats, no danger. The MC5 finished their set and were followed by Big Brother and the Holding Company, with Janis Joplin fronting the band at the height of their performance powers. The band was in the midst of their final song of their first set, "Down on Me," when Paul's total immersion in the music to the point of feeling part of the notes was interrupted with a jolt. "Uncle Russ wants to see you in his office right now," came a stern voice. It belonged to the one security employee the venue employed, the massive Rock Goldberg. At 5 feet, 8 inches tall, 250 pounds of muscle, he was usually cool in discharging his duties. Rock, as everyone called him, always wore a suit, the only one in the crowd of 1,800 people. He was sweating through the jacket since there was no air conditioning and the temperature inside was in the upper 80s. "Now," he repeated, since it looked as though Paul hadn't paid any attention. "Now," Rock repeated gruffly for the 3rd time. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Paul's consciousness was swirling. The Fifth Estate slogan was "Fuck Authority," one the paper published as a poster and a concept Paul usually tried to follow, but the drug rendered him incapable of even inquiring why he was being ordered about, let alone refusing the directive. Rock knocked sharply on the door marked "Grandee personnel only." "Come in," came a bark. Inside the office, the Grandee manager, Jimbo Hooperbag, was counting the night's receipts on a side table. Paul had heard his name dozens of times, but never wondered before if that was the name he bore at birth. He watched, fascinated by the huge pile of singles and $5 bills next to a stack of quarters Hooperbag was counting that seemed to reach the ceiling. The impresario of the Grandee faced him with his hands on his hips, standing behind his desk. He was wearing huge rose-tinted glasses, a tie-dyed shirt that Paul saw the random designs as a moving Rorschach multicolored inkblot test. His bright red trousers with elephant bell cuffs were fastened by a 3-inch wide black belt, cinched with a huge silver buckle in the shape of a lion's head that Paul swore he could hear roar. Uncle Ross bellowed at Paul, "So I'm a fucking capitalist pig, am I?" The wind almost made his shoulder-length hair feel blown back by a gust of wind. The impresario was transformed into a huge mouth who wanted something from Paul, but he couldn't figure out what. His mind was cascading. Oh, yeah. Does he think I'm responsible for that picket line outside? Well, Russ demanded. I was all Paul could manage. Russ launched into a tirade about it. If it wasn't for him, there wouldn't be a Grandee. And did Paul know how much it cost to run the place and how little money he made and how much he had to pay the band? And all of you fucking hippies are a bunch of ungrateful dreamers who don't know how the real world works. He looked at Paul angrily, slightly out of breath. Well, he bellowed again. Paul repeated the same response to the point where Russ began wondering if something was wrong with the accused or if he was just terrified, as he intended. Paul was staring fixated at the giant mouth. Plus, the sound of quarters clanking on the glass desktop was deafening and much louder than the question he couldn't quite comprehend. Paul tried one more time. Just then the door burst open. No one ever entered the Grandee management office without knocking. It was an enraged Janis Joplin. Who the fucking fuck is responsible for turning on that fucking disco ball in the middle of our fucking set, she yelled. We couldn't see a goddamn thing. Do you know how badly that fucked with us? Not being able to see cues from each other? You ever do that again, I'll shoot the motherfucking ball off the ceiling. Russ started. Look, Janis, don't fucking look, Janis, me. Don't ever turn that ball on again. With that, she exited by the still open door that Paul used to make an escape in the midst of the commotion.
Wow.
That sort of happened.
You were that close to Janis Joplin.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't. Yeah, it's okay to tell this. I was in the office when it happened, but I was sort of an insider, and I hadn't been called on the carpet or anything like that. But maybe that does give it away. Never mind.
I think
I instruct the jury to ignore that.
I think when the scene was so young, the idea that there was capitalists involved in the scene was so offensive. We had the same problem at 404 Willis, where we used to run a DIY punk club. And we were a collective of volunteers. It only cost, this is from 91 to 94 in the Cass Quarter. It only cost $250 a month to run the venue, and the shows were all, word of mouth, handmade flyers. We collected the door in cash. We paid the band in cash out of the door. We kept no books whatsoever. We had absolutely no records at all of any of it. It was very underground to a fault. And we had somebody wanted to do a really avant-garde show at the venue, and we said yes, but we didn't really negotiate. We said, sure, man. It was cool, right? So they had this show, and they wanted to charge $10, I think, and we only charged $5 for our shows. And so the inflation wasn't that high from 67 to 91. And they, our collective members of the collective assumed that they could go to any show they wanted. We had a no one turned away for lack of funds policy. And these guys get to the show, and the guy was working the door was like, no, you can't come in. And so I was actually at another concert halfway across town that night. And I got a lot of heck, from my collective members later. Why did you guys let them do a show at the 404? They don't understand how we roll. They wouldn't let me in the show. And
you got a lot of what?
Flack from my friends.
Oh, flack. I thought you said heck.
Well, yeah, heck. I think I did say heck. Give him heck, Peter.
Hey, who was the band? That's what I was going to ask.
Crash Worship.
Okay.
Crash Worship. They did like a tribal ambient drumming. It was like pagan ritual as rock. The last month I lived in Detroit, I was living at Trumbull late 94 before I ran here to Tennessee 25 years ago. I had a friend visiting, and we were getting bored, and we'd probably been drinking a few, and we decided to go down to St. Andrews Hall, where Crash Worship was playing. We had no money, and we went and hung out by the back door, the stage door of St. Andrews, just off to some parking lot there, on Beaubien or whatever, down there. near St. Andrews. And late in the show, a member of the band comes flying out the back door on fire because Crash Worship was known for performance art, pyrotechnics. And so they let us in. They let us in the back door, and we caught the last probably 20 minutes of the show. And part of the ritual is they had a band member in the crowd carrying giant bags of wine. So he would go on to buy, some box wine and taking the bags out of the box. And they had the little nozzle, and they were going around like it was a nipple, giving everybody, communion wine. Half the crowd was naked. It was dark and sweaty. It was this kind of like, just insane, sweat fest, orgiastic bacchanalian, and I, of course, that was who, back in the day, that's who I was. And I was smitten by Crash Worship. So we traveled all the way to New Orleans from Tennessee a couple years later, and they were supposed to do an underground show during Mardi Gras, and we were all bent on it. And I think we had to find somebody to watch Ruby Jazz. Ruby Jazz was about 2 or 3 at the time, maybe 4 at the time. I had to find somebody to watch Ruby. We were going to hit this show. She's probably only about 2 or 3. And but the New Orleans police shut down the Crash Worship show. And then apparently Crash Worship went and had a parade, an unlicensed parade through some neighborhood in New Orleans.
Who was the band at 404 in Detroit?
That same band, Crash Worship.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So anyway, what would you say in retrospect? Do we overly idealize the rock and roll scene of the late 60s in terms of it being connected to the resistance, or with the MC5 and Sinclair and stuff? Were the music really the soundtrack to the revolution, or is that a little bit of exaggerated hyperbole at this point? What do you think?
Well, I'm not the best observer because I was there. By the way, I'm just looking at orders. 3 orders have come in the last few minutes from listening. You go to peterwerbe.com or .org and order my book, Summer on Fire. It was new. It was the first. I mean, I was just looking at, there was a radio station in Detroit, WKNR, Keener, AM and FM, and they played every song imaginable. And their number one, I was just looking at a playlist, their number one song was Dizzy by Tommy Rowe, just this stupid bubblegum piece of music. The second tune in their playlist was MC5, Kick Out the Jams. And they had, Frank Sinatra on there, and their key song of the week was Red Skelton, this old comedian, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. So that was in 65. So in moving away from that and if you hear the music, if people know this song, Street Fighting Man by the Rolling Stones, that the music did accompany every event, all the sensibility of that era, and it was brand new. It said no to the 1950s culture of sexual and cultural repression, of anti-communism and militarism. And so it was part of that. But I would think if I was even 60 or older, I mean, that's what I even feared about the book. People are saying, oh man, are we going to start hearing how cool the 60s were? And by implication, we're not. Well, to those stories you just ran about the 1990s, I'm thinking, wow, I missed that. I wish I would have been there. And so each generation, well, let me just go back to the 50s. 50s sucked, right? Unless you were part of the beatnik movement and you were in San Francisco and North Beach, or you were in Detroit around the Cup of Socrates coffee house, or you were in the East Village during the 1950s. If you're reading Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, then it too was music, because you were listening to jazz, Thelonious Monk and Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, and that was blowing your mind in the same way that the rock and roll, 10 years later, blew all of our minds. So you can make it happen right there, right where you are right now.
I follow Diamond Dave Whitaker, and he's a street poet. He's a friend of Bob Dylan's, and I met him out at the Nevada test site in 1988, protesting nuclear weapons testing in the Nevada desert on Shoshone land. And I'm here on Cherokee and Chickasaw land. I don't know whose land you're sitting on, with our settler our settler ancestors who came and colonized this continent. It was literally going to those kind of events that sort of opened up, all of these horizons for me. So Diamond Dave Whitaker said it was a 3-generation rainbow: beatniks, hippies, punks, and I think that continues today. But I think it's been diluted by those disconnections that you talked about it when you were in the 60s, not knowing your history. I think there are a lot of disconnections, because I open up the Beat Generation to 20-year-old college students every semester in American literature, and never does a student say they've ever even heard of Jack Kerouac or heard of Allen Ginsberg, where they had been pop stars. Most of them haven't even heard of Bob Dylan, and they've heard of the Beatles, but they don't know the name of John Lennon. So it's a really, there's a cultural disconnect even still to this day. And so the storytelling that you're doing in this book is profound. I think I want to be respectful of our question on the live stream chat room here. So Bill wants to know about the era of Goldwater and George Wallace, and sort of the far right of the 60s. Do you think the far right of the late 60s is foreshadowing Trumpism of the current era? And what about the 1960s can teach us about today? And that will lead up to my next follow-up question. But what about, were you aware of the repressive stuff going on down in the South with the White Citizens Councils and George Wallace?
Sure.
What about Goldwater and other far right campaigns of the 60s? Do you think that foreshadowed Trumpism? And what do you think of Bill's question?
Barry Goldwater, who ran for president in 1964 as an arch conservative, would probably be in the moderate wing of the party today. He probably has the politics of like Mitt Romney, but he was considered too far to the right of the mainstream. We knew, of course, we knew about all the repression in the South. Our friends, our comrades, had been down there for things like Mississippi Summer. Students for Democratic Society, SDS, of which I was a member, was deeply involved in it. We did all sorts of support work and sent people down there as organizers. And we were aware of always of a strident proto-fascist right, mostly centered around anti-communism, traditional anti-communism of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, even going back farther than that. Pardon me. And some of them were very militant. And in the book, there is episodes of confrontations, physical confrontations at anti-war demonstrations when the marchers in the anti-war march portrayed are attacked by right-wing fascists and repelled. I like that section considerably. Yeah, someone said
that march is so great, because the mood is so festive but yet militant at the same time. And I've experienced that over the years in many marches.
Sure.
And some people don't like public activism, and they prefer to write letters, or they prefer to organize book studies, or they do prisoner support or whatever. But there's something exhilarating about being with your comrades in the streets, being outspoken. I mean, and to see the uprising of last summer after the death of George Floyd, the worldwide Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 was the largest social movement of all time, and it mirrored the work that you did. We heard a lot last summer about riots. The centerpiece of your novel is an uprising, a Black uprising. Talk to us about that, what that was like being there, but also talk to us about how it's depicted in the novel, and also what do you have to say when the far right today sarcastically says peaceful protesters, ah ha 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 ha, meaning that 98% of all Black Lives Matter protests were completely nonviolent in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr., but because of these outrages, the genuine grievances of the disenfranchised, that there was vandalism and there was property damage. What about the centerpiece of this novel? Let's not skirt around this. This was a Black lower class uprising, but it also involved people who had served in Vietnam. What was the mood? What was the feeling of the story itself? And what can that teach us about the riots of today, or the uprisings of today?
Well, the Detroit Rebellion that occurred in July of 1967, that's depicted in my novel, Summer on Fire, and to some extent gives it its title, was the logical result of what you do when you repress people over hundreds of years. And it wasn't the first. In fact, it was just a few weeks after what had occurred in Newark, and ones had begun. I mean, traditionally, what were called race riots were usually white pogroms against Black communities. The most famous one recently that fortunately we're beginning to learn about again was in Tulsa, Oklahoma in what, 1919 or 1920? I can't remember. One or the other, where white mobs attacked a thriving Black community and aerial bombed it. The first time American City was ever aerial bombed, and burned it out, killed several hundred people. And up through Detroit in 1943, again, when white mobs attacked Black citizens in Detroit, and during the World War II, that had to be suppressed by federal troops being brought in. And there was both, what do they call, in sociology, they call it revolution of rising expectations. The anger at the Detroit police, the anger at the destruction of an East Side community where everybody was shoved out to build an expressway and upscale homes, the day-to-day insults and humiliation and discrimination and disproportionate income and respect and all of that just culminated. And you never can tell. It could have been those things are all fortuitous. If what the spark that began it, if it would have happened, and I don't know this for sure, if it would have happened a day later, maybe nothing would have happened at all. But there's always this convergence of time and opportunity and event where things explode. So yeah, it looked like the whole city was going to burn down. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fires. There were the National Guard was called in at first, shut off 200,000 rounds of ammunition at people, mostly firing randomly. There was rumors of snipers, which turned out to not be actually a single sniper. There's a tendency to want to make it an event of armed resistance, but it really wasn't. It was mostly looting and paybacks against hated merchants that took place. And most of what we've seen so far, including myself, are how white people related to this overwhelmingly Black event, although it was not a reverse race riot. Myself and Harvey Oshinsky, who founded the Fifth Estate, we were all through areas that were both integrated. There was both integrated looting, and at times we would be out on streets where there were maybe 200 or 300 African American people looting shops, and these two white boys, and all we were getting were fives. And I say in the book, they weren't high fives then. They were kind of like people went like that, or you could see what that was. But there was a carnival-like atmosphere, is how the mayor of Detroit described it at the time. He was shocked. He said there was a carnival-like atmosphere. Whereas I said, what did he want? Did he want it to be like 1943 with mobs, white mobs attacking Black people? And the only violence came at the hands of the National Guard and the Detroit police, who essentially summarily executed 43 people. Actually, there were about 6 white people killed, so about 37 Black people, and hundreds of people shot and injured, and thousands of people arrested.
I don't think until we reckon really honestly and profoundly with the looting of the land and the looting of the original inhabitants of this land, until we deal with the looting of the unpaid labor, the still unpaid labor of Africans taken from their homes by violence and shipped here on slave ships, until we fully grasp the savage inhumanity of the white man's crimes against humanity during the period of colonialism, really British and U.S. Well, I don't know what we are. We're a new kind of colonial experiment, cloaked in the rhetoric of the Revolutionary War. But if we don't ever reckon with this, it's never going to go away. And so there is this idea of a return to the reckoning of what this stood for, which of course is the heightened rhetoric that we're experiencing today. But there seems to be a disconnect where people don't realize that as white folks, we can be accomplices and allies and advocates and co-conspirators without being, without falling into leftist tropes of political correctness. I don't even like using that language because I mean, ultimately, we're on the left side of libertarianism, but people don't realize that the fifth estate, I don't say people, I'm saying just in general today, they forget that the fifth estate comes out of a tradition that includes situationism, that includes what used to be called left libertarian thought. I don't know if people even use that terminology anymore, but that we believe in individual freedom. I was watching that CPAC yesterday. I hate to even bring it up, but they were talking about themselves as the party of the skateboarders who have had their skate park taken away by these authoritarians in California who want you to stay home. And so I think they're weaponizing the pandemic against us in ways that they've seized the rhetoric that used to be our rhetoric. And
well, you remember
down, the sky, this up is down and down is up, and the sky is not blue anymore. I'm sorry.
Fascists traditionally have been rebels and carried out armed insurrections, have created their own press, have denounced the ruling elites in the cities or in the countries in which they were active, all throughout Europe. Remember, the Nazis means National Socialists. They had an ostensible socialist program. But one of the things, let me say this, a lot of white people, they go, oh, yeah, right, there we go, Whitey's the bad guy, and all that. I didn't do anything. My relatives came from Sweden or Poland, in the 1920s. I didn't do anything. So the thing that rubs them, of all the things that, all the whining that white people do about black people, one of the worst things they whine about is the call for reparations, that there would be a repayment for the descendants of the stolen labor from Africans. And this will surprise you. I think I don't even think it's a workable idea, because what really should be, there should be programs and redistribution of wealth in which everyone shares, because the majority of poor people are white. Half this country is either poor or near poor, if we can get our minds around that. Because of historic and social circumstances, black people have been most active in the last generation or so. But it's white people that suffer silently and stick behind this, what they think is white privilege, where they don't get shit. They get to say, yeah, I'm white. That's about it. They don't suffer, humiliation. They don't suffer insults like that. But
Peter, I'm a card-carrying union man. I belong to 3 labor organizations. I know that you and I are union brothers because the Communication Workers of America organized the college campuses here in Tennessee, and I belong to UCW, CWA, but that was your union when you were in radio and TV. I went on a drive to Matewan, West Virginia back in the fall to see the site of the Coal Wars, to the Coal Wars Museum, which is by the United Mine Workers in Matewan, West Virginia. And the drive, I was just going to mess me up, man. The drive through Trump-Appalachia was heartbreaking. The drive through Southern Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, and Western West Virginia was heartbreaking. These are people living in shacks, in hollers, and people in Kentucky, working class people in Kentucky who are trying to organize to overthrow Mitch McConnell. We failed. They said we got to get from the holler to the hood, and from the hood back to the holler. But I went through those hollers all through Trump-Appalachia. Every house had built a shrine to the former president. You saw that golden statue that they were carting around at CPAC yesterday. There were private shrines in people's homes to the former president. They'd made homemade signs and banners, and it was every trailer, every shack, and every mansion in certain sectors of West Virginia. We did not see a single Biden-Harris sign for miles. They've romanticized this, and I have a scholar, a retired history professor from Vanderbilt and religious studies professor whose area is the civil rights movement, Professor Lewis Baldwin. He was on another podcast I do called Justice Devotions, and he said the reason why they're winning is they're making people feel good about being white again. And it's just it's ridiculous. But we know. Did you watch the movie, the HBO movie about Fred Hampton?
No.
And the Black Panthers.
Judas and the Black Messiah? No, I don't.
They show the hillbilly patriots, the white working class activists united with the Panthers and with Latino activists. That's shown in the film. It's documented in books. And this is what I got into an argument with our mutual friend David about. It's not a secret. It was on Twitter. People were arguing with our colleague and the host of Fifth Estate Live. Full transparency, David Robick's folk singer. David Robick is the host of Fifth Estate Live on Tuesdays. About this idea: is there a way for working class whites to unite with the current left? I don't even know if there is a left. But yes, the war of the rich against the poor has not been settled, and the populism on the right seems to be more successful because we tried twice. And I know you're not into electoral stuff, but you do you do like this, and you go to the booth like this, like that. We had a guy in Bernie Sanders.
We're off in the weeds.
Who shares our values. Okay, get me back out of the weeds. Get back to your book then, comrade. You brought it up when you brought up the fact that reparations is not the answer, but redistribution of wealth to everybody is the answer. But we believe in a classless, wageless society where the fruits of the earth are shared by all people. That's not on
the political agenda.
The founding document of these guys said that the working class and the employing class have nothing in common, and between these two classes, a war must go on until the workers of the world inherit the earth, seize the means of production, and abolish the wage system. In 1905, they said that. I don't know how many IWW members there are in the U.S., like 100, I don't know, 1,000, 5,000, but there are millions of people in these far right populist organizations today.
Well, there are. One of the things that fascism has and always had, which is so frightening, they have rage and they have energy, and their energy is at such a higher level than anybody you call the left. And the left now has gotten to be like Biden. The left, the actual left of socialists and communists, let alone the sector of politics I identify with, the anarchist tradition. We've got as many people as the IWW, which ain't much. So I don't know. I don't know what we can do in the short run. If someone says what should we do, I look to other people. I look because there is energy in the cities and some in the country as well that hopefully people will at some point say, Lincoln's dictum that you can't fool all the people all the time. I mean, right now the loser has fooled an extraordinary number of people. We can only hope that.
So during the early stages of the pandemic, there were some concerns about commodity shortages. Of course, everybody knows about the worldwide toilet paper shortage of 2020. But besides wiping my butt, there was also concerns about the agricultural sector and other sectors of our economy and the access to resources being limited. And I was so grateful that I knew an organic farmer here that I could get vegetables from and that I'm on a first name basis with. And this is decentralized and it's in my community. And this guy is an ideological right winger. And he's a nice one. I've got some friends like that who are nice people. They're not all nice. Some of them are internet trolls of mine. Some of them have tried to get me fired from my job at the university. I did lose my job at the church that I used to serve. I'm sure you were happy about that, Peter, being my atheist brother. But there are people here that are in the culture war, right? That it's so hard to talk to them because they don't recognize the humanity of my LGBT friends, and you can't
talk to them. It's
a bizarre world that we live in. What would be the greatest gift of this novel? Is it that it's about Detroit? Is it the music? You and I are working on a couple of different playlists, a long playlist and a short playlist. What is the thing about this novel that energizes you the most? Because this is early. You said I'm part of the pre-press. Your official launch is in about 2 weeks, and you'll probably be on the virtual book tour, doing podcasts and videos like this all over the internet for the next couple of months. What is the thing that you're most so thank you for letting me be one of your early interviews, Peter. What are you most excited about this book? Like, what do you want people to? Because I mean, I laughed at the way you and your spouse, or I'm sorry, the not you, the two main characters, the way they fought their little domestic little kerfuffles were so adorable, and it made it humanized the whole novel, because this novel is very sociological and ideological. And so when there's this couple of lovers just having, you know, a kind of a lover's spat, you know, in the middle of all of it, besides Paul and Michelle's love quabbles. I mean, you're riding around in Canada, and you're fighting over what novel to read to each other in the car before you get strip searched by border guards. What would you like the reader to get most excited about? And I see that I've got a friend I just met yesterday. My new friend is on the live stream, and he grew up in Detroit. He also lives in Nashville. A good colleague of ours, and we just met yesterday, and I'm so glad to have my new friend Rob listening in today. Peter, what do you got? What would the reader? What's your elevator speech on this book to a stranger?
I don't know if an elevator. I just a good friend of ours who you know, and some of the listeners may know. But Barbara Logan was reading it, and she said it's a love story to the city and to the community and to the era. And you know, you can and without trying to lord over a particular era over today, or the efforts of people that are involved in efforts today to bring about the kind of world you just described, it gives you an idea that people did it then. In the same way I can read stuff about the Wobblies, the IWW, in 1905 and 1912, and see what they did and get inspired from that. Because if people can do it then, people could do it in the 60s. People could do it last summer. Now we don't have to go so far back. All we got to do is go to the summer of 2020. You can do it now. You can do it in your hometown. And so in many ways, I hope it's inspiring to keep on those ideas. You know what? Won't stop, can't stop.
One of the things that I love about the book, and I really want you to address this, we've kind of danced around this topic, but you and I talked about it earlier in the week when we did a little preview. And I think people are really concerned about this right now, because there has been a lot of violence. The Second Amendment, you know, is being invoked. Ted Cruz last night. I want to quote. I'm sorry to keep bringing these bozos up. I know it's toxic masculinity in all its forms. In his speech at CPAC last night, he said the reason why the rebellions didn't reach the suburbs is because we were locked and loaded, and we would have used our Second Amendment rights. Ted Cruz said that yesterday. The reason the summer rebellions did not reach the suburbs was because we were locked and loaded and ready to kill them if they came. And there's a lot of violence in the story, Peter. But you don't you don't moralize it. But let me go here, and then I want you to respond. You don't moralize it with the sloganeering of the 60s. When the militancy of Bring the War Home was happening, there was this moral narrative of righteous revolutionary violence being talked about by the Weather Underground, the Black Panther Party, and other militant organizations. You don't go there, right? You dance close, but you don't moralize violence, but you don't also moralize nonviolence. So you're agnostic about violence and nonviolence as a narrator, and the narrator is not Paul. Paul does not narrate the story. So the omniscient narrator does not moralize this, yet also tells it like it is. So the reader can get this sense of the tension and the potential for harm to you and to your comrades. So why did you tell the violence that way? And what have you learned about violence, and how do you feel about that today, just as a friend and as an author to our audience, who I think will have mixed feelings? I bet some of our audience members today own a weapon, are NRA members even, and are prepared to defend their homes if they're attacked. And other people are like me, total pacifist hippies that literally believe Jesus and Gandhi's version, which is literally turn the other cheek. And I was at a rally with you. I'm gonna tell the story on you, and I'll let you finish it out. We're gonna wrap this up. Peter and I were at a rally in 1991 against George Bush the First during the Iraq War, and he was giving a speech at an educational institution, and we went there with no purpose other than to heckle. So we were there. We were very rude. We were very obnoxious, and it was a college graduation at the University of Michigan.
Yeah, right.
And I was being so outrageous. And this poor dad, just wanted to see his kid graduate, was ready to beat the crap out of me. His blood was boiling over. And you intervened. and you're a bigger dude than me. They can't see because of our heads, but I'm about 5'7". You're a little bit bigger than me, about 5'10" or 11. Anyway, you intervened on my behalf. And so as a pacifist, I wasn't gonna fight this guy, but I was glad that you were willing to. You know what I mean? So there's some ambiguity there. Give us a takeaway on this whole question of violence in this novel, because it's one of the most unique aspects of it, because you don't paper it over, but you don't justify it or not justify it. Please help me with that difficult question.
Kind of forgot it. You started a long time ago, but let me just go back to that.
I'm not known for my brevity here.
Let's go back to that schmuck Cruz. That it didn't come to the suburbs. Obviously, there were great, enormous demonstrations in suburbs, in wealthy suburbs like Birmingham, Michigan, and Huntington Woods. Rich suburb like Birmingham, Michigan, 1,000 people marching down the street. In Huntington Woods, right near us, 200 people, all white, are marching down these residential streets, chanting Black Lives Matter. There's never, ever been a demonstration in Huntington Woods, Michigan before, ever, like that. So
same in Cookeville, Tennessee, Peter.
Yeah,
same in Cookeville.
Violence, there's for people that have not been involved in violence, there's a tendency of people who dislike the system to romanticize it and to romanticize revolutions. The American Revolution is highly touted. This is a militaristic society that puts a great emphasis on male militaristic values and what have you. During the 1960s, because of the armed readiness of groups like the Black Panther Party, but also the idea that many of the groups wanted the victory of the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong. They wanted the American Empire and its invasion forces in Vietnam to be defeated. Again, what would you say, mystified the process of armed resistance. That can turn out real badly. And I would say that people should have a deep toolbox, but what is appropriate for any particular point is determined upon the circumstances. People were lucky. The black people with guns during the 1960s got killed and are serving, many of them now in their 70s and 80s are still in prison. The white people with guns, they went on to be teachers and radio DJs and stuff like that. So there is a class and racial disparity there. But I think having a deep toolbox is good. One thing about possession of guns, there's no reason to think that what accrues to right-wing gun owners won't happen to left-wing gun owners as well. In other words, accidents, suicides, stuff like that.
Peter Werbe has been my guest for the last hour. I'm Andrew Smith. This is the Ordinary Takes podcast, a co-production of Ordinary Space Fanzine and the Teacher on the Radio program. Peter Werbe is an author based in the Detroit area for most of his life. And an editor and an activist and a dear friend and a dear sibling and older brother who I have missed dearly. And we've gotten a lot closer the last couple of years. And the pandemic makes you want to call your friends and Zoom with them. And I'm so grateful that he spent an hour with us. I want you to buy his book. Sounds like a lot of you are. Peter didn't believe me when I first said it. He was modest, I should say. I was immodest and Peter was modest. I said, Peter, you're going to sell out of this book in the first month, and you're going to need to reprint. But so thank you for buying the debut novel of my friend Peter Werbe, Summer on Fire, available at peterwerbe.org, available in Detroit at actual independent booksellers like BookBeat and Booksource. Stay tuned to Peter's Facebook and his website for more announcements of more book tour events. I look forward to when the pandemic has subsided, at least in the numbers, to where it's safe to dance again, and we will meet you at a dance party. And Peter said one thing. He said, I want people to be inspired by what these stories are and go find out where it's happening in your lives right now. And I guarantee you it's happening somewhere near you, because as we were saying with Black Lives Matter, the largest social justice uprising in the history of humanity, it happened in Cookeville. It happened in Huntington Woods. It's probably happening just down the street from you. Peter, do me a favor. I'm going to do the radio show next week. I can't have you on there, but do me a famous in your best WRIF voice, a famous radio ID. I'll say it to you now. You're going to say, I'm Peter Werbe, author of Summer on Fire, and you're listening to WTTU 88.5 FM, Cookeville, Tennessee, the Teacher on the Radio program. Could you do that for me?
You want me to repeat that? I can't.
Yeah, you want to just say
to
you're listening. You're Peter Werbe, Summer on Fire. You're listening to Andrew Smith on the Teacher on the Radio program, something like that.
Huh.
And I'll just splice that little clip out of this onto the show next week.
I don't know why you got me stage fright. This is Peter Werbe. You're listening to Teacher on the Radio with Andrew Smith. Andrew, rock 'em.
That you did me a solid, Peter. We're going to wrap this up for today. Go buy Peter's book. Check out once we're tweaking the playlist. Once the playlist is ready, you guys are gonna just love. We're gonna have a long version, a 4-hour playlist for you guys to listen to music from the book itself, bands and artists that Peter mentioned. Listen to an edited version of that playlist on my radio show 1 week from today, 88.5 FM at 11 a.m. Central Time. Peter Werbe, Andrew Smith, we're signing off for today. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you. Love you.